Welcome to the best of 2024 on The Proof. This year we have journeyed through a diverse array of topics with a very impressive lineup of guests, delving into science-based strategies for fat loss with Alan Aragon, exploring the science of aging with Nobel Prize winner Dr. Venki Ramakrishnan, and gaining insights into women's health with Drs. Alyssa Olenek and Jen Gunter. We've tackled protein, omega-3s, eggs, redefined wealth, and even examined the role of relationships in our pursuit of a happier, healthier life. All of this, literally all of this, made possible because of you. Thank you so much for tuning in, engaging with the episodes, sharing them with friends and family members, supporting our show partners like 38 Terra and Momentous, and most of all, hanging out with me each week. Or as my mum says, putting up with me. Your curiosity and commitment to better health makes this journey incredibly rewarding and meaningful. As we embrace the new year, I want to leave you with a thought from Robin Sharma. All change is hard at first, messy in the middle, and gorgeous at the end. With that, keep going, enjoy this episode, and from my heart to yours, I wish you all the best in 2025. The average person out there, right? Let's think about that avatar. So they are overweight or obese. So they have excessive adiposity, fat. And would you agree they're probably under muscled due to the sedentary lifestyle that they're living and perhaps not completely optimizing protein?
Yeah.
Right. So where do we start if we're thinking about setting up that person's kind of nutritional framework? And before we get into the actual practicalities of that, perhaps emphasize, what's the problem with a suboptimal body composition? How is that affecting our health or risk of chronic disease? Why do we actually want to work on this in the first place?
Okay, so there's functional issues and metabolic issues with, for example, just looking at the muscle mass side of things, being under-muscled. So the reason why we would want to focus on increasing and preserving muscle mass and strength, especially as people advance in age, is because muscle preserves metabolic function, muscle mass. A lot of the good stuff that happens within the engine of the body happens within muscle tissue as far as fuel use, fuel partitioning, energy use, all that. The building of strength would cover the neuromuscular side that makes us functional, that prevents falls, prevents the complications of falls later in life. And so you need both of those things. So in order to achieve both of those things, you need proper nutrition, holistically, not just protein-wise, but protein and energy and essential nutrition, good food selection, and all of that stuff. So that's why it's so important. And if you collect body fat in excess, then this can actually, it antagonizes health in a number of ways. But when you carry excess body fat, this can actually impair the process of increasing and preserving muscle as well. And the roots of that are probably, as far as we can hypothesize, the roots of that are in a chronic inflammation type of state.
Okay, so let's imagine there's someone sitting here with us now and they want to lose body fat. They've listened to everything we've spoken about so far, and they have a pretty good grip on where they're going to set their protein intake at. A high level understanding that resistance training is going to be important. We haven't really deep dived that. Let's just put that to the side.
Yeah.
That might even be another episode, right? But they want to lose weight. So how important is it for them to think about the energy within their diet, and how do they begin that process?
Oh man, it's tough. It's tough. At a very simplistic level, people have to understand that no matter what your food selection is, I mean, you can choose the most heralded superfoods on the planet. You can choose the foods with the most accolades and the most hype behind them as being the healthiest possible foods. But people have to understand that unless you are burning more calories than taking in over time, you're not going to lose body weight. And so if people understand that from the outset, then they have this vague idea that, okay, I can't eat an unlimited amount of these, in quotes, healthy foods. There has to be some sort of checks and balances system on there for me to eat a certain amount. Now, this can be done purposely, or it can be done by default. But people have to realize when I'm consuming more protein, I'm doing it because I'm trying to increase satiety and control hunger. When I'm consuming more, let's say, unrefined plant foods to get fiber, I'm doing that not just for the various health reasons, but also that will default me to eating fewer calories because I'll be more satiated. That stuff will displace the energy-dense type of junk foods that I would have been eating. And at the end of the day, at the end of the week, it helps me eat less. And so there are hyper quantitative and precise ways that you can eat fewer calories per day or per week, or there are just a little bit more qualitative ways to do it by eating more of certain foods and less of other foods, with the understanding that I'm trying to eat fewer calories by the end of the week. It's totally okay to know that this is a calorie game. And it's totally okay to know, for the more sophisticated folks, I'm really trying to lose body fat while hanging on to as much lean mass as possible.
Right. So there's a couple of different paths you can kind of go down.
Yeah.
Depending on your personality, I guess.
Yeah.
What's going to help you adhere to this best? Is there a rate of weight loss that we're looking for that you would say is safest or the most effective? Is it possible that if you're losing weight too quickly, that could have a negative effect?
Yeah, this has actually been looked at by Garth and colleagues, who compared a 1.4% drop per week in body weight with a 0.7% drop per week in body weight. And so, if you do the math on that, it's going to be like roughly 2-ish pounds, 2-3 pound drop with like 1 to 2-ish pound drop per week. More like 1 pound, 2 pounds versus 1 pound-ish. So the rapid loss versus a slower loss. And the slower loss in this particular population, who were lean athletes, they preserved more lean body mass with the slower rate of weight loss. I did a review paper with some colleagues like almost 9 years ago now, where we issued the recommendation of limiting weight loss to 0.5 to 1.0% of your total body weight per week. And this was within the context of preserving a maximal amount of muscle tissue while losing fat in the contest prep context. And that actually does apply to the general population as well. I think that getting down to a very simplistic heuristic with this, most people would want to keep their weight loss to 1 to 2 pounds a week. And viewing 1 to 2 pounds a week as actually fast weight loss is a healthy thing to do. Because, if you can imagine 50 to 100 pounds lost a year is tremendous. So even though in the literature it kind of comes down to this 0.5 to 1.0% of total body weight loss per week, I think we can even focus a little bit more on the lower end of that. 0.5% of total body weight per week is perfectly fine. And in some of the literature, it shows that quick weight loss at the beginning in the obese population is correlated with greater weight loss and weight loss maintenance in the long term. I still think that if we look at it in terms of percentages, like that most people probably wouldn't want to lose more than 1% of their total body weight per week as a goal. That's as aggressive as you need to go.
Let me share 3 important takeaways from this study. Number 1, animal protein was associated with increased odds of developing one or more of the 11 chronic diseases. You can see that in table 3. Number 2, animal and plant protein were associated with not having physical limitations. But while animal protein increased someone's odds of not being physically limited by 5%, dairy protein did so by 8%, and plant protein did so by 41%. You can also see that in table 3. Number 3, and perhaps most important, replacing 3% of energy from animal protein with plant protein increased one's odds of healthy aging by 38%. You can see that in figure 1 and supplementary table 4. With all of this in mind, I really do not see how this study is positive for animal protein. And if it is, it's dairy protein, not animal protein in general. Later in the video, Lane brings up sarcopenia.
One of the biggest detrimental effects during aging is sarcopenia. In fact, after age 65, you can tie many deaths back to a lack of muscle mass.
I agree with Lane that sarcopenia is a real problem and that protein is important for avoiding age-related muscle and strength loss, that we need to keep people physically fit and active, and that skeletal muscle and being strong can help someone avoid chronic disease. But I don't think Lane is appreciating the fact that chronic disease itself is a huge risk factor for living a sedentary lifestyle and developing sarcopenia in the first place. When people get cardiometabolic issues or cancer, they become less active. So this is a bi-directional relationship. That's why, in my view, you need to be optimizing for both chronic disease risk and physical function to truly promote healthy aging. Remember, animal protein in this study was associated with increased odds of having chronic disease, and plant protein was associated with the highest odds of not being physically impaired. That's some of the key data points that Lane seemed to overlook. Accordingly, based on this study and the wider body of evidence looking at cardiometabolic disease, the best way to optimize for chronic disease and physical function is to ensure that, number 1, you get a good amount of protein in your diet each day, in the vicinity of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. Number 2, have a bias towards plant protein sources. And number 3, do resistance training 2 to 3 times per week. Now, how is the average person doing when it comes to these 3 things? That is a great question. Let's go back through those 3 points. So for number 1, the average adult gets about 1 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram. So there's moderate room for improvement or optimization, especially for elderly or vegetarians or vegans who tend to fall at the low end of that range. Number 2, 70 to 85% of the average adult's protein comes from animal protein. So lots of improvement here. Number 3, about 70% of adults in the USA fail to meet resistance training guidelines. Again, lots of room for improvement here. So most focus really needs to be on doing resistance training and replacing calories from animal protein with plant protein. Then we'll be moving towards a society that has lower cardiometabolic disease risk and lower risk of sarcopenia and physical impairment. Does everyone need to stop eating all animal protein and become vegan? No, of course not. And that is not what this study shows or my position. But dialing back animal protein for plant protein is a favorable move, not just because of this study, but plenty of other studies, like this meta-analysis of 31 cohort studies I'm showing on screen with a combined total of over 700,000 people, whose conclusion was intake of plant protein can be increased relatively easily by replacing animal protein and could have a large effect on longevity. For those of you who are eating some animal protein, and I'm drawing from this recent Harvard study that we've discussed today and the broader literature, fatty fish, eggs, and fermented cheese/yogurt would be the best animal proteins to include from a cardiometabolic health point of view. A pretty sensible set of guidelines to refer to that summarize this and more, the Danish Dietary Guidelines. 30-30-30. I've mentioned it a few times. People are probably thinking, what the hell are they talking about by this point? So what is the 30-30-30 study that you're planning? And then perhaps we can jump in and talk to the specific elements of this framework that, as we just mentioned, are kind of aimed at reducing that hunger gap and I guess essentially making it easier for people to lose weight and keep it off.
And kind of going back to the implementation part of it. So as we've mentioned several times now, lifestyle change is difficult, and some people do really well for a little bit, but then wane at their motivation or life happens or whatever. So trying to come up with something that is simple for them to follow, definitely based on evidence that we have from studies that show we can help people with satiety through what they're choosing to eat. Obviously, lots of evidence about the benefits of exercise, some of what we've talked about already today. So it's really looking at a program that was Kevin's idea, and he can share his other acronym that he shares, but I can never remember. But 30-30-30 is way easier. So 30 grams of protein per meal, 30 grams of fiber per day, and 30 minutes of exercise per day is our 30-30-30.
I love that you chose 3 things that I think are the least controversial of, I mean, there's still controversy probably in certain
I'm sure there
extreme ends of the nutrition world. Maybe in the fiber element, there's carnivores saying you don't need any fiber, and there's probably some people that are staunchly opposed to protein. But generally, most people would agree getting enough protein in the diet, enough fiber, and exercise are three kind of good first steps.
Yes.
And the idea is to deal with both sides of the energy balance equation. And so we've got pretty good evidence that higher protein in a meal will produce satiation, and then satiety lasts a longer period of time. So you feel full longer.
Can we just quickly define satiety, satiation, and hunger? Because I know we're throwing those around.
Right. And these are they're related, but different concepts. So satiety is sort of a feeling of fullness. You've eaten enough. So satiation is the process of moving from, wanting to eat to feeling full. Satiety is sort of how long that lasts. Hunger is that you have a physiological drive to eat. I want food now. So when we do studies to look at appetite, we ask 4 questions. We ask, how full do you feel? How hungry do you feel? What is your desire to eat? And then if you were to eat now, how much do you think you would eat? Prospective consumption. And these are related concepts, but people who really specialize in this area will tell you that they're not identical, and you can have situations where you have desire to eat, but you're not really hungry. You can have other situations where you have a feeling of fullness, and it's not connected exactly to hunger or desire to eat. So, they are related, but most people understand, kind of the physiological sensation of hunger. And most people also understand that desire to eat is not always connected to hunger. So the old, example of that is, there's always room for pie,
Yeah, it happens to me every night.
Yeah.
If I'm on the couch watching Netflix,
Right.
I've eaten enough food. I'm not hungry, but for whatever reason, I'll go to the kitchen and grab something else to eat.
Exactly. And, after 4 p.m., average American consumes more than 50% of their calories after 4 p.m. So they tend to graze through the evening. So it's not because they're ravenously hungry after 4 p.m. It's because they're lonely, bored.
Watching TV.
You're watching TV and something to do with your hands.
Right, exactly.
So,
And it becomes a habit, a routine.
A routine. So with protein, there's an interesting relationship of protein to hunger and fullness. And what we've found, and not everybody agrees with this, so I have to say that, very well-known people in the field, say, no, you're full of it.
I just wrote down Barbara Rolls.
Yep.
So we'll come back.
So actually, this is going to be very much related to the fiber component especially. But with protein, what we found is that if you add protein in exchange for carbohydrate in a meal, you will get more satiation and greater satiety, less hunger.
Is that any type of carbohydrate or refined carbs?
It seems to be any kind of carbohydrate, but it's tied into the fiber component, so it's a little bit complicated. But for the most part, the studies are generally replacing refined carbohydrates, starches, and sugars with protein. And what we found is that under 20 grams in a meal doesn't move the needle at all. When you get beyond 20 grams, you start to see this satiating effect. And when you get beyond 30 grams, it's always there. And it doesn't really seem to be related to the person's body weight. I would have expected that maybe a person who's 240 pounds would require 40 grams of protein, whereas somebody who's 120 pounds maybe requires only 15 grams of protein. But that's not what we've seen. We've seen that we always see the effect when we get to 30 grams of protein or more.
So there's some type of nutrient sensing that's independent of your body weight.
Yes. So that seems to be the case, at least based on the studies that we've done. So when you replace carbohydrate with protein, you get more satiety. And so that's part of the story. And the question is why? Well, Arne Astrup and colleagues in Scandinavia, they have done studies on this, and they show this dose-response effect. When you increase protein as an exchange for carbohydrate, you get a higher GLP-1 response. And then there's an interesting thing, which is that the L cells in the small intestine are not evenly distributed. And so you have more of them later on in the small intestine. And so if you can delay protein digestion until later in the small intestine, that seems to help increase that GLP-1 response. Now, GLP-1 is complicated because we know with GLP-1 receptor agonists, you're talking about supraphysiologic levels. But then there's a class of drugs called the DPP4 inhibitors, and they basically just slow down the breakdown of GLP-1.
Is that acarbose or is that?
No, acarbose is an alpha-glucosidase inhibitor. Yeah. We can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, let's come back to that, because now that you're talking about protein getting to the end of the small intestine, thinking about ways to slow down digestion.
Yeah, exactly. So GLP-1 is released. These L cells are releasing GLP-1, but GLP-1 has like a 2-minute half-life, and it's mostly having effects locally. But there's a lot of connection between the gut and the brain. So you release GLP-1, that stimulates the vagus nerve, sends signals up to the brain, and then you actually release GLP-1 in the brain. But of course, that's hard to study in humans, hard to get people to volunteer for, brain biopsies and such. So,
which presumably then dampens the drive to eat.
Right.
Dampens the drive to eat. And that's what Arne Astrup and others have shown, that you get this larger GLP-1 response. You also have GIP, glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, also known as gastric inhibitory peptide. And
I won't ask you to spell that one.
Yeah, GLP-1, GIP response go up with more protein. So I think we have reasonable evidence to support that view, even though not everyone agrees with it. And so with more protein in a meal, you get more satiety, but you have to get to 30 grams of protein to consistently see that effect.
So you got to get to 30 grams, and then it's improved if you are able to slow down gastric emptying?
Yes. So, slow down digestion of the protein. And so that's where some of the fiber comes in. So as an example, viscous fibers, like what you get in, viscous fibers that you might take as a laxative.
Like a psyllium husk or something.
Psyllium husk. I try not to use, brand names, but I'll say the brand name Metamucil that most people are familiar with. And so that creates a gel in the intestine. And so it slows down digestion because it protects the food from digestive enzymes. It just creates a barrier, and they don't digest as quickly. And so it slows down digestion of carbohydrates and proteins. And so then you digest the proteins more slowly, you get more protein reaching those L cells, and a higher GLP-1 response. That's a hypothesis. And then there's another element to it, which is for fat, which stimulates CCK release. CCK is a protein that slows gastric emptying. There's also a hypothesis that when you have viscous fiber in combination with fat, that is causing the fat to be in contact with the intestinal wall longer and gives you a higher CCK response, which slows gastric emptying. So protein and fiber may be synergistic in terms of helping to control appetite. And then there are other things as well that we can talk about separately, which is they also affect the other side of the energy balance equation, energy expenditure.
Yeah, let's make sure we get to that. I think it was on our Zoom call that we did. That was the first time I'd heard anyone talk about this interaction between protein and fiber in the same meal with regards to how it affects appetite.
Right. And I will say that we need a lot more studies. So these are hypotheses. They're somewhat supported by the studies that we've done, but we need a lot more to be more confident that this is really happening.
What does that look like from a food point of view perspective? If someone's listening and thinking, okay, I've got a good idea what 30 grams of protein looks like, and then the 30 grams of fiber, I'm presuming, is not per meal. That's across a day.
That's across a day.
Let's make that clear.
Yeah.
I was like, I thought I said day. Yeah,
but
definitely a day.
There's you mentioned there, there's viscous fiber. Fiber is an umbrella term, although sometimes it could be confused for a single thing. There's lots of different types of fiber:
right.
Viscous, non-viscous, fermentable, non-fermentable. Is the simple guide of just getting 30 grams from a variety of plants, is that enough to sort of satisfy the body's requirement for viscous fiber and these different types? Or does the individual need to be a little more specific and perhaps including certain foods?
That would take the simplicity away, Simon.
It would.
So we're trying to make
it would
this...
be the next step underneath the 30-30-30 framework.
And honestly, like 30, 42, 30, that's just, people don't have our time with that. So 30, 30, 30 is a simplification. We like to make it as simple as is practical.
Right.
And I should also say for each of these, it's at least 30 grams of protein per meal, at least 30 grams of fiber per day, at least 30 minutes of exercise per day.
But you're right. The protein part, I think it will be fairly simple, although I think some people would struggle as well. So giving them options in terms of a protein supplement or something like that. But I think with fiber, just getting people to consume higher fiber foods is going to be important. And we're considering, maybe we do consider a fiber supplement to get them to the 30 gram minimum.
And in particular, I mean, there are, several foods like oats and barley, for instance, that have viscous fiber. But, to get the amounts of fiber that we're talking about is a bit of a challenge. It can certainly be done with food alone, but I think supplementation with something like Metamucil, as an example, might be helpful as well, just to make it more practical to do.
So what is the difference there between maximal and optimal? How do you define maximal versus optimal?
Sure. I mean, you could obviously go to Google and define it. But when I think about it from a protein metabolic standpoint, so a maximal intake is your only goal is trying to, now, again, I do a lot of acute protein synthesis studies, so I should make sure we're clear on what I'm talking about. And so what we do is we acutely will manipulate exercise and nutrition and see how our muscles remodeling, right? And normally we are viewing remodeling through the lens of protein synthesis as opposed to breakdown, and could be a detailed conversation in itself. But what we see in healthy individuals, protein synthesis is the major variable dictating net protein balance, okay? And if you want to build a bigger muscle or have even a higher metabolic quality of that muscle, we need routine periods of a positive net protein balance, okay? So when I'm studying nutrition or exercise, I'm studying to see how protein synthesis is changing. And in healthy individuals, that's generally given us a good compass for whether or not we're in a positive net protein balance. So the more we can manipulate protein synthesis, the better net protein balance is. All right. So protein synthesis, another important thing to note is it's not a hypertrophic marker. Protein synthesis can be non-hypertrophic or hypertrophic in nature. So I don't know what it's going to translate into. Obviously, you'd have to run a training study to determine whether that stimulus that you're doing that just induced a large increase in protein synthesis is going to, in fact, build a bigger muscle. But what we can tell you is that you're either expanding that protein pool or you're renewing it, making it higher quality, right? So protein synthesis comes in various shapes and sizes, and protein synthesis is not a hypertrophic marker. I see that confused all the time. People always like to say protein synthesis equals growth. It never has, and it never will. It's a remodeling marker, and that comes in different forms. Okay, so that's sort of setting the backdrop of defining this maximal question. So if I'm trying to get a maximal output, my only objective is trying to increase protein synthesis as large as possible and not worrying about any other consequence or any other metabolic fate, right? So you can eat food protein in excess or maximally, get a large rise in protein synthesis, but it's going to be always coupled to a large rise in amino acid oxidation, okay? And generally, you're going to see that oxidative output go up when you're using isolated food proteins such as whey, any isolated food protein, because they're just too fast to get into circulation, right? So whenever you're using isolated protein powders, you're trying to choose or pursue a maximal response, okay? I'm always more interested in an optimal response. And so what an optimal response does, it's thoughtful about what is the other metabolic fate of the amino acids we just ingested. The goal with an optimal response is get a large rise in protein synthesis with a little rise in oxidation. So we're optimizing the food source, right? So it's easy to eat food protein in excess and get a large rise in protein synthesis, but you're also wasting a lot. Is there any problem to that? No.
Friends, if you're looking to sell products online, Shopify is where you need to be. Sure, you can list your product on various marketplaces today, but there's a big advantage to having your own e-commerce store. With Shopify, you're in control of your customers' data and can build direct relationships with your audience, which is key for boosting their lifetime value and scaling your business. Shopify makes setting up an online store an absolute breeze. It's designed not just for web developers, but for regular folks like you and me, making it easy to bring our vision to life with just a few clicks. Check out 38terra.com, an example of a site that Dr. Will Bolsowitz and I built using Shopify. Start by selecting one of 200 plus customizable Shopify themes, and then use the Shopify App Store to improve your marketing, store design, order fulfillment, and more. To get your product out there, boost your conversion rate, and grow your business, start today, right now, by signing up for a $1 per month trial at shopify.com/proof. That's shopify.com/proof. What about these essentially basic areas of our lifestyle that we all know are healthy? Exercising regularly, getting sleep, trying to reduce stress, eating a healthy diet. Do we understand the ways in which these types of behaviors are actually influencing the biology of aging?
I think we're getting a much better understanding. So these kinds of advice have been around for a long time. Everybody, you can read the anatomist Galen from ancient from the classical period, and you'll see in ancient Greek, the guy's written about benefits of exercise. But I think what we're understanding now is, what does exercise do? And what exercise does is it helps with all of these factors involved in regeneration. It can regenerate muscle. Muscle loss is a big problem as we age and leading to frailty. And it can even be involved in regeneration of mitochondria. So there are a number of pathways that are affected. Sleep is when many of our repair and maintenance mechanisms operate. There's a weird thing about sleep, which I didn't realize until I read a very interesting book called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. And of course, once he mentioned it, it was obvious that sleep is not just because we have a brain or eyes and we can close our eyes and go to sleep. Very primitive animals, even unicellular animals, have the equivalent of sleep. They have circadian rhythm, which is the program of gene expression changes through the day. And so it's a highly conserved process. You would think sleep shouldn't evolutionarily exist because we're vulnerable to predators, right?
It's extremely
so
dangerous.
In spite of that, the fact that we need sleep and it's preserved means it's doing something really, really important. And some of it is proper development, and some of it is this maintenance and repair during aging. And diet, of course, we've talked about all these pathways involved in caloric restriction and how an important diet is beneficial. And more than that, a bad diet is also detrimental in many ways. For example, obesity turns on various pathways which are harmful. And I wouldn't have thought obesity would cause cancer, but the link between obesity and cancer is very well established now. And of course, obesity and heart disease and diabetes is very well known. So I think this trio, one thing that we've learned in the last few decades is how this trio actually works in various ways. We still don't understand all of the details, and there's a lot of work going on, but we understand some of the ways in which they affect our metabolism to keep us healthier as we age. And you can think of them as a three-legged stool. For example, if you exercise, you're more likely to sleep better. If you sleep better, you're also going to be less stressed, and you're going to not overeat, and you maybe feel more like exercising. So they tend to act in a synergistic way, a bit like a three-legged stool, all supporting each other. And beyond that, they help you with things like stress, which also is deleterious for aging.
And these things, I mean, they do come with some cost, but they're accessible to most of us, particularly people that are listening to this show right now and have 2 hours to spare to listen to us talk, versus some of the things like Brian Johnson's doing that are extremely expensive.
Yeah. Although I should say he probably does exercise and watch his diet.
And these are the foundations. Yeah. And I think, to his credit, one of the things that he really underlines and emphasizes to his community is that the majority of the things that we know will influence aging and improve your health span are either free or not that expensive relative to all of the speculative, very expensive things that he's doing. Sure. And that's a good reminder for people, because you could kind of land in this place where you think, gosh, I just don't have the means.
Even in the UK, which has a National Health Service, the life expectancy, the lifespan difference between the top 10% and the bottom 10% in terms of wealth is over 10 years. And in the US, it's over 15 years. And even worse than that, if you look at the health span, the difference in health span is almost double the difference in lifespan. That means the poor are not only living shorter lives, but they're living a bigger fraction of their lives unhealthy, okay? At the end of life. And so we talked about these three measures and how they come at no cost. But, a poor person who's holding down 2 jobs doesn't have the time to prepare good food and has to eat on the run, typically some fast food. And as a result, it's also stressed and doesn't sleep well. All of these factors act against you if you're poor. So it's okay to say they're free, but they're only free to people who do have the time.
Right, that's still a privileged statement.
It's still a privilege.
I can acknowledge that. We need to raise the bar as a society and improve quality of life across the board so they become more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Earlier, you mentioned that there are some species that live extraordinarily long lives. Major Mitchell's cockatoo, I think you wrote about.
Yes, that's
in
an
book.
Australian.
Yes, I was pleasantly surprised to see that in there. And we spoke about the shark, the Greenland shark. If we think about the biology of aging, some of these things we've gone through, when you look at their cells and how they're behaving, are they doing a better job at repairing DNA? And
so if you look at these animals, many of the animals that are long-lived have very slow metabolism. For example, the Greenland shark has a very slow metabolism. Another darling of aging researchers was something called the naked mole rat, also has a very slow metabolism. And that then slows down a lot of the progression of aging. However, Major Mitchell cockatoo doesn't have, it's a bird and flies around, doesn't have as slow a metabolism. One thing they've found with some of the whales that are very long-lived, and recently the Greenland shark as well, is they tend to have very extensive DNA repair mechanisms. In fact, where we may have one copy of a DNA repair gene, they might have multiple copies. And so that's definitely a possibility that their ability to repair the fundamental damage, at the very beginning, DNA damage, which then may lead to other kinds of problems, are better dealt with. And we don't know whether their ability to clear damage, these things called autophagy, where we clear out debris and dysfunctional components from the cell. We don't know if that's better in these species or not. So it's going to be interesting to study them. But I'm not sure how much relevance that has for humans. Okay, it's interesting to study, to see what's happening. But then how would you implement that in humans? Are we going to do gene therapy and clone in multiple copies of these DNA repair genes? We don't know. We don't know whether that's safe and what consequence that'll have. So I think right now it's in the realm of academic research.
While we're on cholesterol here, Kellyanne, which was one of two new risk factors added to this latest report, along with, I think it was vision loss or hearing loss, one of those two. So I think people listening that are kind of following along, and I appreciate this is quite detailed. It's been covered in some previous episodes, but hopefully we're covering enough detail to help people kind of grab a hold of it. They might be thinking, okay, I understand that the lipoproteins in the periphery are distinct and separate from lipoproteins in the brain. But then you're saying high LDL cholesterol is a risk factor for dementia. If low density lipoproteins or ApoB containing lipoproteins, like Tom and I have discussed previously, which is probably a little more specific, are not crossing the blood-brain barrier and depositing cholesterol in brain circuitry within neurons, what's the proposed mechanism by which elevated LDL cholesterol in the periphery is having an effect on dementia?
Yeah, so just because it's not crossing the blood-brain barrier doesn't mean it's not accumulating in the blood vessels that feed the brain, the small blood vessels, the large intracranial vessels, the carotids. Of course, the brain needs two primary things to be healthy. We're going to talk about the activation component, but it also needs fuel. Fuel comes in the form of blood flow, oxygen, vitamins, nutrition. If you're cutting off glucose, all those things, if you're cutting off blood flow delivery to the brain because there's atherosclerotic disease, that's obviously a problem in itself. But also think about the downstream inflammation that happens with atherosclerotic disease in the periphery. That inflammation, while LDL isn't crossing the blood-brain barrier, we do know that inflammation can cross the blood-brain barrier. We do know that there's this relationship between high sensitivity CRP, atherosclerotic disease, but also brain atrophy and dementia. Tom, do you have any other mechanisms there?
No, I think you're exactly right. High LDL cholesterol is usually associated with a bunch of other metabolic abnormalities. And the most common cause of lipid ApoB disturbances nowadays is insulin resistance. So is that part of the explanation why, hey, high LDL-C is associated with it? To get real ugly, Kelly and Ann and I discovered within the last year, ApoB, we don't all produce the exact same type of ApoB. There are variants of ApoB. And some researchers have identified a couple of ApoB variants produced in the liver that if that's the type of ApoB you got in wrapping your particles, that seems to be compared to regular ApoB that is not of these variants, is significantly associated with Alzheimer's disease. Again, I don't think we know why. Is that a type of ApoB that just is formed for us for atherosclerosis in the cranial arteries? But there's always more to any study. So there are different variants of ApoB. They're rare. This is not the run-of-the-mill ApoB that most people have, but there's more to the story, as always.
Okay, folks, just us again for another quick breakout. There are a few points here that I really want to stick. Number one, cholesterol levels in the brain are separate to the periphery. Although LDL cholesterol is a risk factor for dementia, it's not that cholesterol in your blood that you test on a blood test in these low-density lipoproteins crosses into the brain. That does not happen. Number two, high LDL cholesterol is thought to primarily increase risk of dementia by causing atherosclerosis in arteries that supply the brain with blood and therefore key nutrients. This atherosclerosis in arteries supplying the brain with blood is also thought to increase inflammatory proteins that can cross the blood-brain barrier and damage cells in the brain. Number three, getting your LDL cholesterol, or more specifically ApoB, to goal as early in life as possible is one of the most important things that you can do to prevent dementia. The 2024 Lancet report suggests that one can reduce their risk of dementia by 7% by addressing this single risk factor. This can be achieved with lifestyle, which I outlined in my recent video on dietary fats, and or using lipid-lowering medications, depending on the person. Okay, back to the episode to clarify a statement made in the 2024 Lancet report on preventing dementia that contradicts this idea that low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs, do not cross the blood-brain barrier. There's a paragraph in this report that confuses me, and I suspect it will confuse others, given what we've spoken about here about the blood-brain barrier and cholesterol not crossing it. And it says, excess brain cholesterol is associated with increased stroke risk and deposition of brain amyloid beta and tau, suggesting a potential mechanism for the link between LDL cholesterol and dementia. Is that confusing to you too?
Yeah, and there's no peer review on that article. Because if I'm doing peer review, how the hell did you measure brain cholesterol would be my first question. And if they can't report that, then how do you know there's too much cholesterol in the brain? So I think they confuse brain cholesterol with LDL cholesterol, has to be my guess.
Yeah, this is the same school of thought I came from before I met Tom, thinking that, LDL cholesterol goes into the brain, but it clearly doesn't. So I think it's a poorly worded sentence.
The kind of take-home point here when we're considering LDL cholesterol is that even though it's in the periphery and low-density lipoproteins are not crossing the blood-brain barrier, it is advantageous from a dementia prevention point of view to get LDL cholesterol down to a certain goal, and maybe we can discuss what that looks like, to prevent certain pathology in the periphery that can affect brain function, brain health.
Yeah, and this was one of the most modifiable risk factors in their report. They attributed 7% of dementia cases to elevated LDL-C cholesterol. And I think that could be variable dependent on the person. So maybe in an ApoE4 carrier where having high LDL-C, having high ApoB is a primary driver for their disease process, that could be a huge, huge portion of their dementia prevention risk strategy.
And my two favorite preventive neurologists are very aggressive in making sure ApoB is controlled in their patients because it's one part of this scenario there.
What are your kind of just general views on dietary patterns and dementia prevention? And if someone was, wanting to look something up online, is there like a resource that you would recommend?
So I also was very surprised and disappointed that diet didn't make it into one of their modifiable risk factors, especially because of the overwhelming evidence. I think what's really tricky, and this is with a lot of these risk factors, it's hard to study dietary interventions, but there is a plethora of evidence that things like ultra-processed foods are bad for brain health, and there's ample studies that support the Mediterranean and Mind diet in terms of being associated with the lowest risk for cognitive decline. And honestly, Parkinson's too, dementia, Parkinson's, all of them. So I think that there is a brain healthy diet. And I think if someone really wants to learn more about what foods may benefit the brain most, they should read more about the Mind diet.
Right. Okay, cool. I think that was Professor Martha Morris. I think she was the main kind of creator of the Mind diet and researched various studies looking at how adherence to a Mind diet affected risk of dementia. So that's a good resource. Look up the Mind diet. And Martha Morris, I think, even has a book on that. What about supplements? We've kind of spoken about DHA. Are there any like known supplements or isolated nutrients that you would be like, yep, people should definitely be supplementing these to reduce their risk of dementia?
So there's no one supplement that I would recommend for everybody. And the Lancet Commission also does not recommend any supplements. That's not to say that I don't think that certain supplements can help somebody, the right person at the right time, at the right dose. So I'll just do a double click on, since we talked about omega-3s, I'll do a double click on B vitamins. I don't think that everyone needs to be supplementing B vitamins, but we do understand that B vitamins are so important for various neuronal processes, and that people with B12 deficiency, which may not even show up as deficiency based on some labs, have cognitive impairment, and it's a reversible cause of dementia. So B vitamins should really be optimized in everybody. And if you aren't, for various dietary reasons, if you're vegan or vegetarian, you may be low on B vitamins. So it might be something that's worth considering depending on your individual case. But at minimum, checking levels of B12, folate. I know people are like, well, no one's folate deficient. Yes, they are. I've seen it. And homocysteine can be really helpful.
Okay, so you just touched on homocysteine. That was my next question. So you're looking, like at blood work, you're looking at homocysteine and maybe some of these other markers like MMA, which I know a lot of people order that to get a deeper look at B12 than just kind of standard serum B12.
Yeah. And of course, there are limitations with using homocysteine and various reasons for why someone might have elevated homocysteine that have nothing to do with B vitamins. But for a lot of people, elevated homocysteine is related to B vitamin deficiencies.
And elevated homocysteine, is that associated with increased risk of dementia? Is that something that if you see on a blood test, you're like, right, we're going to try and find out what the root cause of that is?
Yeah, there have been lots of studies looking at this, and homocysteine, high elevated levels of homocysteine are associated with brain atrophy on brain MRI, specifically in the temporal lobe. So another thing that we really think about, and whether that's the homocysteine itself or the homocysteine just a marker for other badness that's happening, we don't know the answer to that. But if it's something that we could correct with very low risk intervention, I think it's worth exploring.
Okay, so nutrition, to summarize, check out the Mind diet. Look at that as just a kind of high level framework, and then individualize it to suit you. Optimize omega-3 index, Could we say that?
Yeah,
So
that's something I
could
think we talked about with Tom.
Right. So that could be, and you could go back to our last episode with Dr. Dayspring, and I've had other episodes on that. That could be achieved through your diet or some combination of fatty fish and supplement. So there's different strategies depending on the individual there, and then specific supplementation after that, really just to be guided based on blood work and presentation. There's no magic supplement out there at the moment.
Unfortunately, we do not have a magic pill to prevent Alzheimer's disease.
It sounds like it's not really an even playing field. Like some people are dealing with heightened hunger relative to the next person.
Right.
Is it that you put on weight and then as a result of that you become leptin tolerant, or is it that, be it genetics or other reasons, certain people are just more leptin tolerant or have less GLP-1 sensitivity from birth?
Yes. No, this is a very good question. And we tend to believe these days that, and this is our culture out there, right? That there should be no differences, everybody is equal, and we are equal, and right? But in terms of our genetics, we are so similar, but also so different, right? Some of us have a predisposition, right? To be more obese or to be less obese, right? Or predisposition to develop diabetes. Even if you have obesity, I mean, let's go deeper, if I may, right? Not each and every, and we have realized that not each and every obesity is also the same. So some of us have more or less storage space in their adipose tissue. Mm-hmm. All of us have the subcutaneous adipose tissue.
I've heard people describe that as a personal fat threshold.
There is a threshold, right? So some of us have a small storage space. Like think about your apartment, your house, right? And you have your storage room, right? Some people have little storage space. Others have plenty of it, right? So for those of us who are fortunate to have a lot of storage space, potentially, in our subcutaneous adipose tissue, you can store their fat, your body weight can increase, and to the extent that fat remains where it is supposed to be, in the subcutaneous adipose tissue, you have no medical problems.
So if it stays in the storage room, not a problem.
Not a problem.
But if it's overflowing into the living room and the kitchen,
that's when you start creating problems.
Right.
So about 22% of people, especially women, maybe slightly more obese, if fat is not spilling over in other organs, we call them metabolically healthy obese. Could be chubby or obese. There is no problem, no need to treat them, right? But if the fat goes where it should not be, liver can cause fatty liver disease, can cause cirrhosis and liver failure, death over a period of decades, right? Not over a period of months. If it goes to muscle, it causes insulin resistance for people who are predisposed to develop insulin resistance. And the longer and the higher the degree of insulin resistance, the higher the risk to develop diabetes. If it goes to our vasculature, it's the same process. Atherosclerosis. It goes to our brain, right, and causes inflammation, neurocognitive decline, Alzheimer's.
So you got to keep fat out of the muscle, fat out of the arteries, fat out of the liver, fat out of the brain.
And right. And the very first, right, and most indicative marker is the belly fat, intra-abdominal fat, right? So if you see intra-abdominal fat, you know that most probably you have fat in muscle, you have fat in the liver, you have ectopic fat.
Once you understand where this liver fat comes from, you can take actionable steps to reverse your metabolic health, to restore optimal metabolic health. Depending on how long the fat has been accumulating, there's a strong chance that you can turn things around. Before we get to what we can do about it, Now that you understand the physiology that underpins increasing liver and pancreatic fat and the onset of type 2 diabetes, I want to quickly answer 2 questions that may be on your mind. Number 1, why is it that 2 overweight people with the same body fatness can have different metabolic health, one with type 2 diabetes and one without? And number 2, how is it that 1 out of 6 people who develop type 2 diabetes have a normal BMI? They aren't overweight. This first scenario is explained by the personal fat threshold concept that we went through earlier. 2 people that are overweight, both of the same body fatness, can have very different levels of fat inside their organs. Person A may have a much greater capacity to store fat subcutaneously than person B. So for a given amount of total body fat, less fat enters person A's liver and pancreas, and thus they're less likely to develop type 2 diabetes. Of course, if they gain more weight and exceed their personal fat threshold, they too can develop type 2 diabetes. But for that to happen, it will take more body fat compared to person B. It's also worth noting that just because person A does not have type 2 diabetes, someone who may be described as having metabolically healthy obesity, it does not mean that they are at less risk of chronic disease than a normal weight person. It's pretty well established in the literature, and this is often a point of confusion, that even someone who's classified as having metabolically healthy obesity is still at significantly higher risk of a number of chronic diseases compared to someone of normal BMI. This second scenario also comes back to the personal fat threshold. A minority of people have a very small subcutaneous fat storage compartment, which means even at a normal BMI, excess energy is stored within their organs. This is the person who develops prediabetes or type 2 diabetes who doesn't really look overweight from the outside. The good thing is, in both contexts, be it overweight or not, people can put their type 2 diabetes into remission if they take action soon enough. This brings us to the next crucial topic: how to reduce ectopic and visceral fat stores to restore metabolic health. Thanks to Professor Roy Taylor's research, we now understand that in many cases, people can restore their metabolic health, even those with type 2 diabetes who are on the far right end of the metabolic health spectrum. The goal, as you might now expect, is getting fat out of your liver and pancreas. And Roy Taylor's work has identified how much weight people need to lose on average to achieve this. If someone is overweight or obese, they need to lose approximately 15% of their body weight. So if someone weighs 250 pounds, they would need to lose about 37.5 pounds in order to get below their personal fat threshold and see these important biomarkers that we've discussed move into a more favorable direction. This, of course, needs to be done under medical supervision, because as the weight comes out of these organs and blood glucose control gets better, you are going to very likely need a lower dose of blood glucose lowering medications. The risk here is that if you lose this weight and don't titrate your dose down with your doctor, you may end up with low blood glucose, which can be very dangerous. What I think is really interesting is that in Roy Taylor's trials, it became clear that if people lost 15% of their body weight and kept the weight off, they were able to stay free of diabetes even if they were still overweight or obese. What mattered was getting under their personal fat threshold to get enough fat out of the pancreas and liver. Of course, if they were to regain that weight, the diabetes would come back. Now, you might be thinking, you mentioned that 1 in 6 people with type 2 diabetes are not overweight. Is it really safe for them to lose 15% of their body weight? Great question. Actually, until very recently, it wasn't even understood if liver and pancreatic fat was to blame for type 2 diabetes in people with a normal BMI. Just last year, Roy Taylor and his team published a study called the ReTune study that confirmed the twin cycle model applies to all people with type 2 diabetes, even those who are a normal BMI. The only difference is that these people do not need to lose 15% of their body weight to put type 2 diabetes into remission. 70% of subjects in this study entered remission with an initial weight loss of 6.5% of their total body weight. So for a 170-pound individual, that's about 11 pounds of weight loss. And while we don't have this data, these weight loss targets would presumably be even less if someone had prediabetes. The same principle applies. Weight loss is required to get below your personal fat threshold. How much weight will depend on your starting point, but really one should work with their doctor and be guided by biomarkers: HbA1c, fasting blood glucose, ApoB, waist to height ratio, HDL cholesterol, and blood pressure. When we're trying to optimize metabolic health, we're looking to normalize these markers as blood glucose lowering medications are titrated down. While one could do a myriad of scans to quantify fat in their liver and pancreas, it's really the normalization of these markers that matters most. They tell you that there is less fat in the liver and pancreas and their function is normal or improving and moving towards normal. Before we discuss how to lose weight, it's really important to note the importance of timing here. The earlier you get below your personal fat threshold, the better. In these studies, people who have had type 2 diabetes for a few years are much more likely to reverse the condition than those who have had type 2 diabetes for 10 or more years. Much of this comes down to the health of the pancreas. If the beta cells are still functional, which is often the case when someone has had type 2 diabetes for only a few years, with weight loss, they can come off all blood glucose lowering medications. However, it is common for people who have had diabetes for over 10 years that those beta cells are completely dysfunctional and they won't regain function with weight loss. This doesn't mean that weight loss for this person isn't helpful. It still is, but they may still require insulin and other blood glucose lowering drugs to make up for that loss of pancreatic function. This episode is proudly brought to you by NordVPN, my go-to VPN for secure internet browsing at home or on the go. A VPN, or virtual private network, creates a private, secure connection by routing your internet traffic through a middleman server, protecting your data from hackers. This is especially important on public Wi-Fi, places like airports or hotels, cafes, places that I tend to be quite regularly, where our information is most vulnerable. Beyond protecting you from risks like identity and credit card fraud, NordVPN is also great for accessing geo-restricted content. I'm not sure whether I should be sharing this, so let's keep it between friends here. Using NordVPN, I can connect to a US server while in Australia to stream movies or sports unavailable locally. Yeah, I do that. NordVPN truly simplifies online security and opens a world of content, all for the price of a cup of coffee per month. I use it across all of my devices, including my phone. Stay protected and enjoy more freedom online with NordVPN. To get the very best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/theproof. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. You can find this link in the episode description. When you say high risk, because I realize we haven't really defined this yet, but let's say someone goes out and they do measure nanomoles per liter, so they get a kind of particle count. And I've looked at risk thresholds from different consensus guidelines. It seems to be a little different across the world, with some guidelines suggesting anything over 100 nanomoles per liter is kind of, you're in high risk territory. Some saying over 125 nanomoles per liter. So I'll get you to comment on what you think is high risk, but then also, Tom, how is that affecting? Because here we're talking about atherosclerosis. I want to come back to aortic valve complications, which, because you kind of said at the beginning, we need to treat these two separately. But if we think about what we would say is an elevated Lp(a), whatever that figure is, how much is that increasing someone's risk of atherosclerosis?
Well, you're going to be speaking in generalities. Just like with high ApoB, there are some people who got scary levels and they don't seem to manifest atherosclerosis. They're a minority. But as scary as Lp(a) is, which I started off the first statement, it's the most inheritable cause of atherosclerosis, is there are people with high Lp(a) who do not get atherosclerosis or aortic stenosis. If you're a clinician and you measure it and it's very high, you should assume that person is going to be a very high risk. But one day, perhaps, and I think it will come with accessory tests that we can evaluate, my God, you're the one person with very high Lp(a) we don't have to worry about. But for now, let's use what is considered you're in the danger zone or you're not with Lp(a). And there would be 2 sets of metrics, depending whether you're looking at milligrams per deciliter, Lp(a) mass, or molar concentrations, LP little a particle number. So with the mass, normal is considered under 30 milligrams per deciliter, but the guidelines will tell you you're not going to be in big trouble until it starts hitting 50 milligrams per deciliter. And maybe even when it gets to 70, that's the really high risk with LP. But the 30 milligrams per deciliter is the 70th percentile of the human race. So that's a pretty high threshold. And, when you're starting to talk 50 and 70, you're into the 90th percentiles of what they should. They should be scary levels. So with respect to particle counts, normal would be an LP little a particle number under 50 nanomoles per liter. And the guidelines will, and they differ a little bit. As you said, you might see 100 nanomoles per liter, 125 nanomoles per liter as, oh my God, you're now in the high risk territory, because you're starting to approach the 80th and 90th percentiles of LP little a in the population. Now, there are some people who go up to 200, 300. I mean, there are some oddballs out there with 500 or 600 nanomoles per liter. But I don't know, are they at that much more risk than the people who have 250 nanomoles per liter? Before I said, well, maybe the super extreme ones would have a little worry for venous thrombosis too, but I think their atherosclerotic risk is very high. Like everything else, there have been suggestions by some of the experts. No guideline says it per se, but if we had two people with the exact same it's in the high risk territory, is there a way of saying who would even be higher risk? You basically start looking at other risk factors. So if you also have an extremely high LDL cholesterol, non-HDL cholesterol, ApoB beyond your LP little a, if you have hypertension, if you're a smoker, if you have coagulation disorders, diabetes, they would make whatever a given LP little a number is worse. But that's almost true with ApoB too. So if you had an isolated ApoB and I subsequently found out, oh my God, you're hypertensive, diabetic, strong family history, you'd worry about that ApoB a little bit more. So it can be influenced by what else you might be dealing with a person. But those are the numbers that at least would scale you into the lower, intermediate, or high risk zone with LP little a.
Tom, if someone's listening and thinking, okay, I haven't measured LP little a, and I've heard Tom say that LP little a is one of these ApoB containing lipoproteins. It falls into that family, and they have measured ApoB and it is optimal. So let's say it's physiologic. It's 30 to 50 milligrams per deciliter or even lower. And let's just presume in this example that we're talking about someone with amazing genes or someone that's taking lipid lowering drugs to get down to that level. And they're thinking, well, I've kind of measured ApoB and LP little a falls underneath that umbrella. Is there a need for me to even go out and measure LP little a?
The answer would be yes, twofold. One, you can do cascade testing in your first degree relatives, your children, your brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles. Say, hey, you go get LP little a checked. So it is an abnormal genetic disorder. So you can advise relatives to get it checked if you have discovered it. But if you have an ApoB of 30 or less, here's where I think you still could be at risk. And this comes out of the two recent PCSK9 trials, Fourier and Odyssey. PCSK9 inhibitors are basically the only drugs that are on the market that, in addition to lowering apolipoprotein B dramatically, do lower lipoprotein little a concentrations in the 25 to 30% range. And they looked at the Fourier and the Odyssey trial when they gave those people, obviously one got alirocumab and the other trial evolocumab, the two PCSK9 monoclonal antibodies that we use here. And they did notice that even once their LDL-C was corrected, If you also lowered LP(a), there was additional lessening of residual risk, additional event reduction. And it seemed to optimize when you got the LDL cholesterol down to around 30. So for some reason, maybe you have a genetic LDL cholesterol of 10. Would high LP(a) not matter? I mean, that would be a guess at this time. And I don't know that anybody has done a genetic study to look at that. But using what the PCSK9 inhibitors, reducing it, you got to really reduce it a lot. And most people have elevated LDL cholesterol, ApoB, who are taking the standard lipid modulating drugs, statins or ezetimibe, never reduce their LDL cholesterol below 50. Some of them do their ApoB below 60 or 50. So and those drugs would not be doing anything to LP(a), even though you would say, hey, you've reached the LDL-C goal under 70 of the guidelines. LP(a) is still causing residual risk. And we actually have data from the statin trials that show that.
And so that residual risk, just to make sure I'm hearing that correctly. So you can enroll subjects in a study who have pre-existing cardiovascular disease. You can put them on lipid-lowering drugs, get them to goal, so get their ApoB down to 30 milligrams per deciliter. So LDL's right down. But there's still going to be some people that have cardiovascular events. So are we saying here that it might be that those events that are occurring despite very low ApoB could be driven by elevations in LP(a) and the effect that is having on pre-existing plaque?
Yeah, or it's LP(a) is part of initiating plaque also, not making existing plaque worse, which it does, but it's part of the initial atherogenesis cascade also because of what it's bringing into the artery wall. It basically starts the inflammatory process a lot sooner. But there is another little part of this story that shows you how much perhaps you have to reduce lipoprotein(a), and it's from the Mendelian studies, where they certainly have shown it's causal. High LP(a) is causal of both atherosclerotic disease and the other aside, the calcific aortic stenosis. But we're talking about atherosclerotic disease. And from the Mendelian data, you can deduce, well, how much do you really have to lower LP(a) before all of a sudden the atherosclerotic signal disappears in the Mendelian study? And the first one that was published, and was a big evaluation, shows you probably have to reduce LP(a) concentrations by 100 nanomoles per liter. So that's, 100 milligrams per deciliter. So that's a big drop. And even PCSK9 inhibitors, which I just told you, do seem to reduce risk a bit, not totally. They're only reducing it by 20, 30%. You're never going to drop an LP(a) by that magnitude with a PCSK9 inhibitor. That will be the realm of the new drugs that are coming that we alluded to that interfere with the construction of LP(a), either genetically or with the marriage of ApoA to ApoB within the liver. So you're pretty much always going to have to worry about LP(a). Most doctors who are even treating lipid disorders are not lowering LDL cholesterol to 30 or ApoB to 30. Some in the know or on the avant-garde are, but most are not. They're saying, hey, if I can get your LDL cholesterol below 70, I'm doing a good job. One reason they say that is because to drive it any further, you start have to adding a third and a fourth drug to drop it so much with the current state. And that gets to be problematic for a lot of reasons. So there is residual risk. The biggest trial that sort of showed that was the Jupiter. I think the heart protection also showed it. Is in the Jupiter trial, which was a lot of people, and they were tested with rosuvastatin, which is a very good drug at lowering LDL cholesterol. But they had a number of participants who had high LP(a). Most people know statins do not decrease LP(a). So if you're going to give rosuvastatin to somebody with high LP(a), you will reduce their LDL cholesterol, their ApoB of the non-ApoA LDL particles, but you won't reduce LP(a) mass or particle number. But in the people with high LP(a), rosuvastatin did lessen the occurrence of MACE. Now, they didn't lessen it as much as they did as rosuvastatin to the people who didn't have high Lp(a), which just goes to show you lowering ApoB by itself or LDL cholesterol helps a lot, but there will be residual risk if Lp(a) remains high. And so you can't lower it with a statin. So statins are a key part of getting LDL cholesterol and ApoB of the regular LDLs to goal, but you're not going to solve any Lp(a) mediated pathology with a statin. Ezetimibe likewise has no effect on Lp(a), has a nice effect on ApoB and LDL cholesterol, but you're going to have residual risk with that. So that's why ultimately we're going to need ApoA lowering therapies. And we will talk more about the PCSK9 whenever as to how that lowers Lp(a).
A lot of people, including my friend Dr. Paul Saladino, believe that ApoB is overhyped and suggest that instead we should be focusing on the triglyceride to HDL ratio in milligrams per deciliter as a proxy for insulin resistance. Paul claims that you want your triglyceride to HDL ratio to be under 2 as an indication that you have good metabolic health. You're not suffering from insulin resistance, and therefore you don't have to worry about your high ApoB or high LDL cholesterol. His point being that whether or not ApoB or LDL cholesterol is atherogenic depends on context. If you're metabolically healthy, his position, as far as I can tell, is that you need not worry about your ApoB or LDL cholesterol level. He thinks we're blaming the wrong thing. For what it's worth, let's entertain this notion that triglyceride to HDL ratio is a marker of metabolic health for just a moment. After converting my results to milligrams per deciliter, my triglyceride to HDL ratio is 1.1, well below Paul's less than 2 recommendation. Back to Paul's claim that it's metabolic health, as indicated by triglyceride to HDL ratio or even HDL itself, that matters, not ApoB. I think we need to put this under the microscope. Now, so you know that I'm not misrepresenting Paul, trying to represent his position as best as possible, here he is discussing this very claim on the Minimalist podcast.
If you look at the Framingham data overall, as you go up, it's a straight line that kind of goes up to the right, meaning the more cholesterol, the more heart disease. But if you break the cohort down by a third variable, and that variable gives you some indication of your metabolic health or your insulin sensitivity, a very different pattern emerges. And you get 4 lines based on the metric that I've seen used is HDL cholesterol. So HDL is canonically thought of as good cholesterol, but it's much more complicated than that. But in this case, HDL is a good proxy for insulin sensitivity because generally people who are more insulin resistant, which is synonymous with prediabetes and diabetes, have lower HDL. Diabetics tend to waste HDL. It's just human physiology that a pre-diabetic or diabetic state results in higher triglycerides and lower HDL. So if you subfractionate the total cohort of the Framingham study by HDL, you get 4 lines, right? HDL less than 25 or 25 or less, HDL 25 to 50, HDL 50 to 75, or HDL above 75. You can choose whatever cutoffs you want. And the people with the highest HDL, these are people who are going to have generally insulin sensitivity. They're going to be metabolically healthy, right? People with the lowest HDL, most likely to be diabetic, pre-diabetic, insulin resistant. Okay? Follow me so far?
Yep.
The people with the highest HDL in the Framingham cohort have basically a straight line that's flat. They don't have any connection between the amount of LDL in their body and the incidence of coronary heart disease.
Oh, wow.
The people with, or like a very, very small upslope, very small.
Now, please note, before I get to my main point here, something I want to make very clear is that Paul is referring in this clip to the Framingham study, which is an observational population or epidemiology study, a type of science that he usually says is highly unreliable. The fact that he's decided to cite it here to support his argument, well, that's a story for another day. Let's keep going. While there is definitely some truth to what Paul is saying, that people with poor metabolic health have a higher risk of coronary artery disease, his claim that risk does not increase or only slightly increases as cholesterol goes up in metabolically healthy individuals is something I would disagree with. Paul's own graph, which he refers to in this clip and also in his episode on the Joe Rogan podcast, shows this. And I believe that graph comes from a 1977 paper published on the Framingham study, as far as I can tell anyway. For those watching on YouTube, I've put the graph that Paul is referring to on screen. And for those listening along on audio, I'll do my best to explain it. It's clear that the group with the highest HDL, which Paul says suggests that they are most metabolically healthy, still have an almost doubling in risk of coronary artery disease as their cholesterol goes up. When you plot that group of subjects, those with the highest HDL, on a graph by themselves, that doubling in risk becomes more obvious, which I'm showing on screen now. Sure, granted that their risk isn't the same as someone who has poor metabolic health and high LDL cholesterol, but that's kind of expected. In one scenario, you are stacking multiple risk factors, and the other, you just have one. To say that there's no increased risk in coronary artery disease or little increased risk with high cholesterol as long as you're insulin sensitive is just inaccurate. Furthermore, and maybe Paul just missed this, but there's a specific paper on the Framingham offspring cohort published in 2016, so much more recent than the 1977 paper he cites, which again shows that low LDL cholesterol results in a lower risk of coronary artery disease than high LDL cholesterol, even in the context of high HDL cholesterol and low triglycerides, i.e., even when people are metabolically healthy per Paul's definition, it's better to have lower LDL cholesterol. One of the main reasons that high LDL cholesterol, or ApoB, still increases risk of atherosclerosis in metabolically healthy people is because the cells that line artery walls, endothelial cells, they can be compromised at specific locations in the arterial system simply due to the high pressure local environment that they're in, unlike endothelial cells in veins, which are in a much lower pressure environment. This local environment is enough for ApoB containing lipoproteins, like low density lipoproteins, to cross into the artery wall, become retained, and kickstart an inflammatory process that leads to atherosclerosis, cholesterol being deposited in the artery wall. And this happens when ApoB or LDL cholesterol rises above those physiologic levels. Here's a quote from a recent review on this. Atherosclerotic lesions in the arterial tree often occur, especially at bifurcations, i.e. at sites exposed to turbulent blood flow leading to mechanical shear stress on the vessel wall that affects the endothelial cell homeostasis by, for example, pro-inflammatory activation. Interestingly, lesions do not develop in veins under normal environment of low pressure and high flow. But when veins are used as arterial bypass, for example, aortocoronary venous bypass, they may develop atherosclerotic lesions, probably because they are subjected to high pressure. End quote. The take-home point being that at a certain concentration, cholesterol on its own is enough to cause atherosclerosis in arteries, even with good metabolic health, because arteries are prone to damage, simply because they're arteries, and blood is being pumped through them under high amounts of pressure. Keep LDL cholesterol down to physiologic levels, 20 to 40 milligrams per deciliter, and there's not enough of these lipoproteins to pose a threat. Here's another quote from Peter Libby, preventative cardiologist and professor at Harvard Medical School, that speaks to this. And I quote, "If the entire population maintained LDL concentrations akin to those of a neonate or to those of adults of most other animal species, atherosclerosis might well be an orphan disease." Meaning that atherosclerosis, the number one cause of death globally, would be incredibly rare. With this in mind, my view is to optimize both. Get ApoB to goal depending on your risk profile and be insulin sensitive, i.e. have good metabolic health, which per the results that I've just shared with you is what my lifestyle has helped me achieve. Paul's way of eating optimizes his insulin sensitivity, but because of the large amounts of saturated fats that he's consuming, it comes at the expense of his ApoB. My way of eating optimizes insulin sensitivity and ApoB. How do you feel about the whole cholesterol years concept? Have you seen that, where it's kind of akin to pack years with cigarettes, so kind of lifetime exposure to cholesterol? And I can I can remember a chart that I've seen in a paper, and it's when you go over a certain sort of 1,000 milligrams per deciliter of cholesterol, then you're at a stage where I believe you may start to see symptomatic atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Have you seen that graph that I'm talking about?
I have. I think conceptually it makes a lot of sense. I actually have a graphic that I use in my teaching that sort of uses the same concept. But I think in the clinic, it doesn't really resonate for me, partly because I don't know what their levels have been that whole time. I would have to extrapolate based upon where they are now. People, LDL cholesterol levels don't change that much over time, but they do change. They change with puberty. They change throughout adulthood. There's a gradual increase.
And menopause, like you mentioned.
Big changes. And by the way, when I say LDL cholesterol, I'm also including ApoB.
We're going to come back to ApoB, which is meant to be what the
I know
the focus
that's
is.
Okay.
We kind of digress a little bit there, but when in clinic, would you not order ApoB? Is there ever a scenario where LDL cholesterol, non-HDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides tells you everything you need to know, and there wouldn't be any kind of extra information that you would get from ApoB that would change your kind of clinical management of that patient?
Yes, I think there are scenarios where I don't need to know somebody's ApoB. I have to think about when that is. Mostly, my first thought about that is that it's after I've already established that their ApoB matches their LDL cholesterol. So when it's so-called concordant with their LDL cholesterol. So if I can learn that from the LDL cholesterol, the current standard now is that if I want to know somebody's ApoB, I have to order that as a separate test. And every time I order a separate test for an individual, I generate a bill, right? The lab is going to charge that person and their proxy money to do that measurement. So someone has to pay for that.
In what percentage of the population would you say ApoB correlates really well to LDL cholesterol?
I think the number's around 75 to 80%.
Okay.
That the discordance rate is somewhere in the, and maybe I overstated that. I think it's somewhere in the 1/3 kind of range. I think I maybe overstated that. So maybe 60 to 70% is concordant.
And so discordance in that, say 25% or whatever it is when you measure their LDL cholesterol, it's a certain number. You then measure ApoB, and that ApoB is dramatically lower or higher than you would have predicted.
Discordance is not well defined in the medical literature. I think I know it when I see it, but there's a lot of different ways that you can describe it. When there's a major discordance, it's obvious, but there's also minor discordance. So the concept of concordance or versus discordance is based upon population-based tables. So in our paper, we looked at tables from 3 different data sets. The first one is the National Health and Nutrition Survey, the NHANES, and using data in untreated adults over the age of 18 between the years of 2005 to 2016, because that was the database that we had. And in untreated individuals, you can form a data table of what the range of LDL cholesterol is in that population. And it's a survey. And if I remember the number correctly, it was something over 12,000 individuals in that data set. So the range of LDL cholesterol, it may not, you may not capture anybody with like rare diseases or anything, but it's meant to be representative of the society at large. And then you get a similar range of ApoB. So that data set, we had ApoB levels on all those individuals as well. And you can see whose level is in the 5th percentile for ApoB and the 5th percentile for LDL cholesterol. You can see who's in the 50th percentile for both. You can see, what the numbers are for the 75th percentile. And so you can create a table and put them next to each other and see if they line up. So we made a table using deciles. And if somebody's in a different decile, you could, I suppose, refer to them as being discordant. So if you're in the 20th percentile for LDL cholesterol, but the 30th percentile for ApoB, you're discordant.
Mildly.
But it probably doesn't matter biologically. But if you're in the 20th percentile for LDL cholesterol and the 80th percentile for ApoB, it probably does matter.
So the issue is if you I mean, I'll get you to elaborate on this. There's probably a couple different issues that could arise in clinic, but I come in to see you. I show you my LDL cholesterol. Let's say it's 80 milligrams per deciliter, and you're thinking, and let's say I'm untreated. You're thinking, well, that's not too high. Could be lower, but it's not crazy high by any means. You don't measure my ApoB. You just assume that it's correlated. Meanwhile, my ApoB could be 120, 130. Yeah. So they're discordant, and because ApoB is what really is determining risk, not LDL cholesterol, I'm now someone who's untreated with higher risk than you thought.
Exactly. That's one of my greatest fears, is that we have untreated patients who we're undertreating because we think they look fine. And that discordance, if you don't measure ApoB, you don't even know that that's the case. You can also do this with NMR and ion mobility and look at LDL particle number. But in the, I don't want to get too much into that because I know less about measuring particle number than I do about ApoB. But ApoB is a well-validated, reproducible, inexpensive way to estimate the number of atherogenic lipoproteins. And so we have these now we have these population-based tables that we can really look at that, and we can do what are known as discordance analyses. Definitely not my expertise in how those are done, but there's a lot of different ways that discordance analyses have been done. You can look at above the mean versus below the mean and call that discordant. But that also means that if you're in the 49th percentile for one and the 51st percentile for another, you're discordant. And that doesn't distinguish between 20th versus 80th, unless I'm sure there's some parameters to how that's done too. But that's one way, is just above versus below the mean for numbers.
Does it really matter if you're discordant or not, the label, or is it just about getting LDL cholesterol and ApoB to some desirable level based on who you are?
Oh yeah, thank you for cutting right to that, because that's actually where I was going, which is none of that really matters. What I will tell you is that all the different discordance analyses that have been done have confirmed that if you're trying to predict has more residual risk on treatment, ApoB is a much better tool for doing that. Whether you're using the older Friedenwald formula for calculating LDL cholesterol or the newer Martin Hopkins or Sampson NIH formula, it doesn't matter what LDL cholesterol formula you use, ApoB is still going to outperform LDL cholesterol.
This episode is proudly brought to you by 38 Terra. Try 38 Terra's DMN prebiotic, the science-based daily multivitamin for your gut microbes, a simple and delicious way to take your gut health to the next level. Now back in stock in new and improved packaging for customers living in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Get 10% off your DMN at 38terra.com using the code THEPROOF. That's 38terra.com and use the coupon code THEPROOF for 10% off. At a very high level, when you say microvessels, what we're talking about here are, you said arterioles. So arterioles, which is kind of the end part of the artery system that's bringing blood towards some type of tissue. Capillaries, and then venules.
Venules, yeah.
Right. So the capillaries are connecting the arterioles and the venules.
Yes.
Okay, and that's where the nutrient exchange kind of takes place.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the blood's flowing through the arterioles into the capillaries. It's bringing nutrients and other important compounds, and then the metabolic kind of byproducts, waste products are carried away from the tissue from venules.
Yeah, in venules, which then coalesce into larger veins.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then carry it back to central circulation. So you said a few times these are really, really, really small. So how do you study those? I know you said you cannulate them. What does that mean? How do we actually look inside some type of blood vessel that's thinner than a strand of human hair?
Well, if we're looking at the blood vessel itself, we can dissect it out. So with practice working under a dissection microscope with very fine dissection instruments, you can dissect it away from tissue. Another way of thinking of these small or microcircuitry blood vessels, they're the ones that are inside the tissue. So you've got to get it away from the tissue to be able to look at it. And we simply dissect it out. And when I say cannulate, we're taking small glass tubes, and we're putting those glass tubes into the inside of the blood vessel or the lumen. And then we take very fine suture and tie the blood vessel down onto that tube. And we do that at both ends. So you've got this cannulated vessel connected to two bits of glass, which are then connected to pressure reservoirs to keep a static pressure within the blood vessel, and we can change that pressure.
And we've spoken about some of the downstream, I guess, complications from microvascular dysfunction in people with diabetes. So we spoke about neuropathy, retinopathy. What about outside of the setting of diabetes? If you have dysfunction of these small vessels supplying the heart tissue or skeletal muscle, presumably we're seeing other complications in that setting.
Yes, we're learning more and more about that. Cardiac events, you think of obstruction of blood vessels in the coronary circulation is leading to some plaque being disrupted and then going down and blocking the small vessels. But it's now realized that in a lot of cases, when people come in with chest pain and they have to go to the catheterization laboratory to be studied to look to see whether they should have a stent or something to unblock the arteries, that a lot of people don't have any evidence of a blockage or a significant blockage. And it's thought what is happening is that there's dysfunction of the downstream microvessels and they're becoming overcontractile, and
which means they're constricting more than they would in a physiologic setting.
Yes.
So in a pathophysiologic setting, they are tightening.
Yeah. So that you end up with angina or ischemic pain within the heart because you're not delivering the tissue, which is active enough and enough nutrients.
So what's the working hypothesis that would explain why these small vessels that are kind of infiltrating heart tissue would constrict? Does that come back to the function and health of the larger blood vessels? I know you've spoken to me previously about like the stiffness of the big arteries affecting the small blood vessels.
This is probably a more functional constriction within the blood vessels. So that's going to occur in small arteries or arterioles just above the capillaries. And it's probably occurring because there's some sort of dysfunction of the endothelium. Either its inability to make a dilator like nitric oxide, or that it's making an excessive amount of a vasoconstrictor, which constricts the blood vessels as opposed to dilates them.
What would potentially explain why that's happening? Is that age-related? It changes? Is it genetics? Is there some type of modifiable risk factor like inflammation or insulin resistance? Why would that be happening?
Well, it's probably a mixture of many, many things, but there is certainly likely to be a inflammatory reactive oxygen species sort of environment that's causing it. So some of those are potentially modifiable through lifestyle
can you get blockages in these small vessels? So we often hear, pretty much always hear, that atherosclerosis, it's occurring in the carotid or coronary artery, and they're much bigger in terms of diameter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, presumably, this whole system, all the way from the big arteries down to the arterioles, are exposed to the same kind of ApoB containing lipoproteins or LDL cholesterol, the same inflammatory proteins. And I think if you were to kind of hypothesize without knowing everything about the system, you would think blockages would probably first occur in the tiny, tiny vessels that have a much smaller diameter. But then there's different environments in terms of pressure. So like what explains why we see atherosclerosis in bigger arteries and not in arterioles?
Well, there can be a number of different reasons, but the physical forces and the flow patterns are different in those larger blood vessels. So there are areas of the circulation that are more susceptible to the development of atherosclerotic plaque. I think in reality that you're probably going to be seeing a mix of these two things, that there is atherosclerotic development. It's just not at a point of critical blockage.
It's not explaining the angina. What you're saying is, in some cases, the angina
yes,
is explained by the kind of collapse. Is that an appropriate term?
No, it's not collapse. It's an active constriction.
Active constriction.
Yeah.
But subconscious.
Yes, you've got no control over it.
Mm-hmm, unfortunately.
But you likely see interactions that are occurring too between the small vessels of the heart and the larger vessels, so that if you get this enhanced constriction of the microcirculation, it wouldn't be surprising if that changes the pressure and flow patterns upstream, which could make vulnerable plaque or plaque that's more likely to come off.
So are there drugs that people are testing or have been clinically studied that could modulate that or attenuate some of that constriction?
Yeah, people can take vasodilators. But in terms of more specifically doing it, I mean, there are trials that are going on that are looking at blocking anti-inflammatory events, for example.
This probably also gets to the question that I often see from people that I think take the position that LDL cholesterol or ApoB containing proteins aren't really a problem, which is certainly a kind of anti-consensus position, I would say. They often say, well, why don't we see blockages occurring in the venous system? Why don't veins get atherosclerosis? And I'm sure, given your research into the pressure differences in vessels, that's something that you've come across.
Well, the pressures and the hemodynamic profiles are very different, but the cells are also very different. If you do a some sort of screening profile where you look at the makeup of the endothelial cells, and the endothelium on a vein is different from the endothelium on an artery. So to assume that something, because it happens in one part of the circulation and should happen in all parts of the circulation, it's doubtful.
When you say well-fed or adequately fed, we've spoken a bit about carbohydrates, but you mentioned protein earlier. I mean, what do the foundations look like for you? Is it that do you, like many people I hear in this space, kind of say, set your protein, get enough carbs, and then fill the rest with fat? How do you approach this?
So I think, yes, I'm very pro moderate to high protein intake for women across the entire lifespan. I think that is something that many people neglect or struggle with. I think a lot of women struggle to get enough protein intake in, either because one, your caloric needs are lower, so it's harder to have like almost a higher relative percent, it feels like to you, to get that in, or that appetite might not be there, or just not something that you historically have done. So I do think that having that and I think there is some data that suggests that females don't necessarily need all the way up to that 1 to 1.2 that sometimes is recommended. So I'm okay with that 0.8 to 0.9 up to 1.0 grams per pound of body weight. You guys can do the kilo math
per
in
pound.
my head.
Yeah,
per pound. You'll have to divide that by 2.2, so to speak, or 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, or about 2 grams per pound of kilo of lean body mass, I think is also a helpful tool for people if you have body composition data and you know that as a minimum. Let's eat to at least support our lean mass. I think that's more helpful with people who have a good bit of lean mass.
2 grams per kilogram of lean body mass.
Yeah, give or take. Yeah.
Which is probably around 1.6 or a little bit higher grams per kilogram of total body weight.
Yeah, I would say that 1.6 to 1.8 is probably grams per kilo. Now that I'm seeing a slide from back in my head that I made once on this for kilo, is probably about that range. I don't think that we have to go to that perfect 1.0, or I think it's 2 grams per kilo of body weight for that. I think that, I've seen some data where it kind of flattens out on the curve after about 0.8-ish for women. But I think there's benefits across the entire lifespan for that. But especially if you are struggling with your hunger and satiety, and you feel like you can't lose fat, and you feel like you're not making progress in the gym and you're not recovering, that's usually a sign that, hey, maybe increasing my protein might help that, because it increases satiation. If you are someone who struggles with that hunger and satiety, it's going to improve your exercise recovery. You're going to be giving the amino acids that your body needs. And then especially when we think about, the luteal phase or menopause, those are time periods where that's probably even more important to be more dialed in with that. I'm of the stance that you don't need to periodize your protein to your period, because you just should eat enough all of the time. But you might need those higher demands, but I think that's I have these 3 key things that I think are the most important for women and females, and it's enough protein, enough carbs, and enough calories. That doesn't mean to say fat isn't important. So to go back to your industry of standard of set the protein and let your carbs and fats kind of fall where they are, I think that's great for regular everyday people. But if you're shifting that volume or intensity up on your training, you're probably going to have to shift that carb preference a little bit up. Have a bias
to carbs, which means dialing the fat down a little bit.
And dialing fat down a little bit. And so that's something I see a lot too, especially when people struggle also too, because they're I gained weight when I trained for a race, or gained weight when I trained for a marathon, or whatever that looks like. And I'm because you're hungry and you're not eating enough carbs, and so your body's increasing that hunger because it's wanting to recover and replenish and restore those. But everything around us is hyperpalatable, and everything around us is high fat. And I struggle with this, right? I'm aware of this, and I have a really high carbohydrate demand, and I joke, I say, fat's find me. No matter, I have to be super, and I'm not restricting fats by any means, but I still have to be super diligent that I'm not blowing up my calories with fats when I know my body needs the carbs to support and recover me. And so that's where I'm okay, as you start to shift past maybe those exercise guidelines, if you're 2.5 hours a week in the exercise guidelines and you're a regular person doing stuff, just eat enough carbs to support yourself. But once you start getting into that, okay, I'm exercising 3, 4, 5, or if you're doing even more than that, you're training for that first marathon and you've never trained for a marathon before, you're going to have to shift that preference of that intake, and it'll make you feel fuller, you'll recover better, you'll perform better, you're gonna feel better. It's really scary for people because of the narrative around carbs, but I think it's really important for me to really reiterate that your body isn't just storing these and causing these massive insulin spikes. It's using them to replenish your glycogen stores. They're going into storage. They're not even necessarily your body goes in and out of fat storage and burning throughout the day, but you're refilling your glycogen stores, or your body's using it for energy, for recovery and repair. It's not I think that's a hard thing for people, because they only think of food going in to be stored and turned to fat, rather than, your body's using that to sustain and fuel the recovery or performance or training that you are doing. And again, not everyone has those high performance goals, but I see all the time. I see my young pop clients start training for the first half marathon, or their marathon ends. That's the first really big spike in cardiovascular activity they've done, or they've always ran and they decide they're hey, I need to add in strength training. And they're why am I always under recovered, or this is really hard, or I'm not adapting? And it's because they didn't adjust their food intake to that increased demands on their body. And that's where I kind of have that view of don't bring a diet view to your training. Always make sure that you're feeding and fueling yourself for the activity that you're doing. And that's not to say you can't have fat loss goals, but you probably shouldn't be training for a marathon and having a fat loss goal at the same time. Like that might be something that you need to separate so that you can focus on the thing that you need to be doing at the same time.
Someone listening.
Yeah.
And she's like, I just want to grow my booty.
Yeah.
Right. So let's focus on one body part here.
One body part. All right.
Okay. What principles does she need to be thinking about? What does she need to adhere to, follow in order to get that muscle group to respond?
Yeah. One, I won't rant on this, but I will say, well, because we just talked about this, if you want to grow your butt, you're going to have to eat. That's the first mistake that people make when they're trying to grow their butt. It takes a lot of calories to grow a butt. So I'm just going to put that out there. Two, you want to think about mechanical tension. So mechanical tension is going to be the biggest driver of muscle growth and hypertrophy. And that is putting tension on the muscle. So it's essentially stretching to that load. And then you want to think about really going through that full range of motion and getting the most out of that tension when you're doing strength training programs. So you don't want to be doing so for example, like the hip thrust is really popular for females. And I'm transparently a little bit of a hip thrust hater because I just don't really like it as much. But I think that they miss out on the fact that that's a compliment to things like that, but you want to still be doing these training moves that are doing full range of motion that you can load heavy and put tension on the muscle that you're trying to go, or that's a good example of a partial range of motion or a top range of motion focused exercise. I don't think that.
What's the benefit or advantage of going all the way to the end? Or closer to the end of the range?
You're getting that full stretch of that muscle. And a lot of I'm not the hypertrophy expert. From what I know from this field though, is that full range of motion is where you're getting the most benefit and most hypertrophy potential or the greatest results. There's some stuff coming out now about partials and if you should do short range or long range, but for 99% of individuals who aren't in that bodybuilding sphere, it doesn't matter. Especially the people that are probably listening to this and consuming this, you don't need to get into the weeds of that because what we know makes you grow is going to be going through the full range of motion. So we're talking full range of motion squat patterns. And it doesn't have to be just barbell squats. It can be your split squat or your lunges. Those are great for glute development or lower body development, which I know a lot of women want to grow their lower body. Or full range of motion RDLs or, thinking about large muscle group activation, getting the most bang for your buck. And then yes, with things like the glutes, you can refine, maybe you are doing some hip thrust as a complementing, or you're doing maybe some isolation stuff of, the smaller muscle groups. But the things that are going to get you the most bang for the buck are the movements that are going to take you through that full range of motion and that you can load heavy. A heavy step up is going to get you probably way more of a stimulus for growth than your 30-pound banded glute kickback, so to speak. You want to be able to put load and tension on that muscle. And then, of course, there's a component of volume that we talked about earlier, which the load itself is part of the equation of volume. So volume is going to be your reps and sets by load. And then it's essentially total tonnage or pounds or kilos that you essentially moved in that training session. And you want to progress that over time. So the way that you do that is either you do more sets or you do more load. And you don't want to sacrifice load for intensity. You don't want to go to 30% of your 1 rep max and not do it for enough reps and sets, so to speak. You still want to make sure it's a high enough for that stimulus. But
you can only really increase sets per week to a certain point where those workouts just become way too long.
And I think there's a pretty big consensus of you can go up to 20 or 20 plus high volume for hypertrophy sets per week. And there's this big conversation around that right now. But you don't necessarily need 20 sets per week to make something grow, but it's more about the quality of the sets that you're doing. And I think a lot of women fall into the trap of doing a lot of quantity, but not that quality because this isn't just women. I think everyone in Gen Pop underloads their weight training. They don't lift heavy enough or they can do more than what they're doing.
Is it normal for women or people who menstruate that spend time with one another for their cycles to sync up?
No, it's a myth. Everybody gets really upset about it. Seriously, I'm who do you think's sponsoring me? Big non-period syncing? Yeah, it's a myth.
So where does that come from? And if someone's well, hang on, actually, my girlfriends and I, we all have our period at the same time. What's happening?
Yes. So there's great explanations for it. It's just a really fascinating social or cultural phenomenon. So I don't actually know the history, meaning did people believe it in the 1600s or did people believe in the 1800s? I don't really know. But you have to also know that they didn't know about hormones and they didn't know about things. So they were just very concerned about making sure people menstruated because they thought it was a buildup of toxins. So I don't think they were like really specifically thinking about that. Maybe they weren't, I don't know. But in the early 80s, there was a study that suggested that menstrual syncing or menstrual synchronicity, that sounds like a album, doesn't it? Like, that's my new album. It's Menstrual Synchronicity. It's dropping soon. Call me, Taylor. So there was a study that suggested it. Now, if you go back and look at the study that has some flaws with it and isn't, probably wouldn't have been accepted today the way it was in the early 80s, that's also pretty common from a lot of studies, right? We learn more, we, have different methods. We couldn't do hormone tests and things in the early 80s the way we can do them today. So there's a lot of things that change. It's been looked at by several different researchers since in larger studies with, better design, and it hasn't shown. And there's no biological reason it could happen. So the people who propose it never propose a biologically plausible hypothesis. So people go, what about pheromones? Well, so no one has actually ever proven the existence of human pheromones yet. I know the perfume industry would like everybody to think otherwise, but it's never been proven. And
Jen Gunter busting myths left, right, and center.
I'm so mean. This is what makes people think I'm mean.
How dare you?
I know, how dare I? And it's because we don't have a functioning vomeronasal organ. So, and that's what dogs and cats and animals that can detect pheromones have. And so ours doesn't work. So what's traveling through the ether from me to somebody else? And if you think about it on a different level, I find it really distasteful because it kind of makes women sound like they're seasonal breeders, right? That there's this alpha female that can drag all these other like lesser females into her menstrual orbit. I don't know. So when you hear these myths, very few people kind of follow them through to their logical conclusion. So what does that really, like if we keep going on that line of thinking, what's that telling me? And almost always when you go along that line of thinking, it starts to sound like worse and worse and worse for how you're talking about women.
Sometimes it can sound like a nice story. For example, like in this example, I've heard people say, well, the ancestral or evolutionary explanation is that perhaps there was survival benefit if women were going through their pregnancy at the same time and giving birth to babies at the same time.
Well, so we would know it though, because that wouldn't have been a trait that we would have lost. So we would be seeing people coming in, all the pregnancies happening at the same time, and then for 2 or 3 weeks in labor and delivery, like we would see that. So that's not something that happens. And there's no biological basis for it. I mean, your own body controls your cycle. You have agency. I don't mean that you think it to happen, but your body is your own agency. It's not, somebody else isn't controlling you. We don't ever say that about men. We don't ever say that like, wow, testosterone is such a powerful hormone. It can drag all men into having erections, right?
Slightly related, yet unrelated. It gets me thinking about, is it accurate, or is there any truth to the idea that when a woman is on oral contraception, on the pill, her taste in men is different than if she was not taking the pill?
No.
Have you heard that?
Yeah, I've heard it. The research is not very solid. There are other people who have disproven it. And, none of these studies control for reasons that people get divorced, right? So people might stop the pill because they're not planning on having sex with the guy that they dislike and are wanting to get divorced from, right? So stopping the pill had nothing to do with, oh, wow, I'm with the wrong man. It was a planned decision because why would I take contraception for someone I'm not having sex with? So there isn't any good data to support that. And I think that people need to be very, very careful making grand proclamations based on not solid data at all. There's no evidence to support it. And of course, all my friends, I have a couple of friends who've never taken any hormonal contraception. And they're like, well, how do I explain my 3 divorces? And so also that kind of positions men as not having responsibility in a relationship falling apart, right? It's all about you and your hormones. Really? So yeah, the grander the claim, the more extravagant the claim, the grander the evidence needs to be, and it doesn't exist. It seems to serve a very specific narrative of keeping people away from using medication that can be very useful for them. So there's one other thing I'd like people to think about when they believe that they've had menstrual sinking, is that think about a time when you've been driving and your windshield wipers are going and it's raining and the car in front of you windshield wipers are going. And there's times where your wipers are matching up exactly with them. And then there's times where they don't, and then they match up again, and then they don't. And that's what's happening when you notice somebody's cycle being the same as yours. You're only remembering the time where they are matching up because of random things. This is a random change. So if you have two events that are occurring randomly, they will match up at times, and then they won't, and then they will, and then they won't. But because of recall bias, you just remember the times that they were.
But Jen, I want to believe that when I look at my phone, magically, it's always 11:11.
I know. Humans, we are weird creatures, and we like to hold on to little beliefs. And again, I just think that I just believe it's important to have the facts, because while we can say, well, what's the problem with having a menstrual sinking myth? Okay, well, there isn't really a problem, except, well, what if it makes one person feel like they're always submissive to the group? What if one person's made to feel like they're always following? Do you think that might maybe affect them a little bit? Well, that's a possibility. And these myths, and this is also an issue, are weaponized by the wellness movement, by people trying to tell you that, oh, well, you shouldn't be on hormonal contraception because you're going to miss all these important rhythms that we learn because of cycle syncing. So it becomes part of this narrative that's very easily warped or used in another way. So I just think that's why it's important to know. So if you want to believe something that's not true about your body, okay, that's totally fine. But just remember that these things are often misused by people who have ill intentions.
And so the chapter you mentioned is recruit a dead board of directors. I think that's in the chapter, the fifth form of wealth, which is money. And so I think it's really important to surround yourself with people whose lives you want to be living. And so if one of the forms of wealth is money, and there's nothing wrong with it, what I'm trying to say in the book is money is only one of the 8 forms of wealth, but I'm not saying money is not important and it's dirty and there's something wrong with it. You can do amazing things with financial freedom. And the chapter is recruit a dead board of directors, which is, you want to learn how to be a financial tycoon, read Frank Brady's book on Onassis. You want to learn how to be forgiving, read about Mother Teresa. If you want to read about being an athlete, read the books from the great athletes. So we often say, well, how do I do it? Or I'd love to have a mentor. Just go buy their books and recruit this dead board of directors to advise you and read their books, be influenced by their approach and their philosophy and their habits. And then maybe if you have a key choice, go into your quiet room, close your eyes, and ask this silent board of directors what their advice is. And imagine what Mandela would say, and Mahatma Gandhi, and whoever it might be.
It's clever. You mentioned journal tactics, and if we don't cover that, come back and cover it. There'll be people saying in the comment section you had Robin Sharma on, and he mentioned journal tactics, and you didn't dig in. What are the main journal tactics that you would want to leave someone with? How do you journal in a way that is going to be most productive, most influential on your life?
Well, I would say, first of all, do it every morning. What you do daily is so much more important than the few things you do annually.
Amen to that.
And that's one of the most key things I would humbly offer all of your viewers from around the world. Your days are your life in miniature. If you want to predict your future, look at what you're doing today.
Okay, let's bring this home with a summary. The 5 key takeaways. Number 1, eggs, while low in saturated fat, making up just 2.5% of the saturated fat in the average American diet, do contain a significant amount of cholesterol, about 200 milligrams of dietary cholesterol per egg. This can affect blood cholesterol levels differently depending on the individual. About 30% of the population are considered cholesterol hyperabsorbers, meaning they absorb a larger amount of cholesterol from their diet, potentially leading to higher blood cholesterol levels. Number 2, to determine if you're a hyperabsorber of dietary cholesterol, consider testing your phytosterol levels, particularly beta-cytosterol and campesterol. This can be done at various labs worldwide, and the results will help you tailor your dietary and health strategies. Number 3, if you're identified as a hyperabsorber and have high ApoB, lowering cholesterol-rich foods in your diet can make a big difference. For some, especially those at low risk of cardiovascular disease, simply reducing animal-based proteins like eggs, shellfish, meat and organ meats, and increasing plant-based foods such as tempeh, tofu, chickpeas, lentils, beans, etc. will be enough to get you to your target ApoB level. Number 4, for those at moderate to high risk of cardiovascular disease, dietary changes alone may not be suffice. In these cases, discussing lipid-lowering medications like ezetimibe with your physician is important. Ezetimibe is particularly effective for hyperabsorbers as it blocks cholesterol absorption from both food and bile, essentially offsetting the function of those genes that are working against you. Number 5, if you are not a hyperabsorber, so about 70% of the population, that means foods like eggs and shellfish that are rich in cholesterol but relatively low in saturated fat at the same time probably aren't affecting your ApoB dramatically. They'll still have some effect, but the lever that you're going to want to focus mostly on is lowering saturated fat in your diet in exchange for mono and polyunsaturated fats if your cholesterol levels, or more specifically, ApoB is high. I would focus here initially and then look at dietary cholesterol and foods like eggs if you can't get to an ApoB of 80 milligrams per deciliter or lower. I go through how saturated fat affects cholesterol and these dietary swaps in more detail in a recent video I did on dietary fats that you can watch here. I'll put the link to that in the show notes for those listening on audio. For people with healthy blood cholesterol levels, 1 to 2 eggs a day can feature within a healthy high fiber plant predominant dietary pattern, a Mediterranean diet, pescatarian diet, vegetarian diet, etc. But equally speaking, eggs don't have to feature. And one of the inevitable questions that comes up here is, but what about choline? Eggs are rich in choline, and choline's important for the brain. So what happens to your brain health if you remove eggs completely? I've added choline to my list to tackle in an upcoming video, so hit subscribe and follow if you're listening on audio on Spotify or Apple, and you can tune into that in the not too distant future. Imagine your body's omega-3 level as a fuel gauge. Just as you wouldn't try to fill up your car without checking the fuel level first, it's important to understand your current omega-3 status before making changes. That's where testing comes in. By measuring your omega-3 levels with an omega-3 index test, we establish a baseline that allows us to tailor our approach to your specific needs. Once we know your baseline omega-3 index level, we can explore the various supplementation options. My omega-3 supplement strategy is as follows. It seems sensible to supplement with the minimum dosage of DHA and EPA per day to get us to an optimal omega-3 index, so we can optimize for long-term health benefits, minimize adverse effects like atrial fibrillation, and save some pennies along the way. For most people, that's going to be in the ballpark of 1 to 1.5 grams of active DHA and EPA per day. I've personally done this, supplementing with about 1.5 grams of DHA and EPA per day, and over around 9 months, I saw my omega-3 index go from 5.76% to 9.44%. Now that I'm above 8%, I'm actually going to slightly reduce my dose to approximately 1 gram of DHA and EPA per day, and then retest 4 months after making that change to see if I'm still above 8% with that slightly lower dose. Why 4 months? Well, the omega-3 index is based on the fatty acid composition of red blood cells, and red blood cells take about 4 months to turn over. So if you change your diet or supplement protocol, wait at least 4 months before you retest your omega-3 index. Omega Quant, who I have zero affiliation with but highly recommend for omega-3 index testing, actually has a dosing calculator on their website, which suggests that someone like me could get to 8% with around 810 milligrams of DHA and EPA per day. If I could achieve that, I'd be very happy. You might be thinking, why 8%? Why not 12%? This is something that I asked Dr. Harris. Are there continued benefits up for grabs going up above 8% to 12% and beyond?
In practical terms, it's far more important to just at least get to 8%. So few people are at 8% that to try to worry about being at 12% is almost a fool's errand. We haven't got very much data on large groups of people with omega-3 levels at 10, 11, 12%. There just aren't that many people like that. So we really don't know. That's kind of why our limit is say 8 to 12, and above 12, we just don't know. We're not going to make any promises. There is some evidence, though, from Japan that people that were at 11% omega-3 index compared to those at 8%, they had a lower risk of, I think, myocardial infarction. So in Japan, you can do things like that. You can look at those sort of levels. So that was some evidence, and there was a paper recently, or not recently, but a few years ago, that pointed that there might be even additional benefits above 8% for cardiovascular. But I think that's still yet to be really studied well.
When choosing off-the-shelf supplements, I recommend opting for brands that have gone through third-party testing for purity, oxidation, and contamination. I've managed to get this information from third-party testing that I've paid to access from organizations like consumerlab.com or directly from the brands themselves, providing they were happy to make their third-party testing reports available. I've also ensured that the brands that I recommend contain DHA and EPA, not just DHA, because as I mentioned earlier, there is mechanistic evidence that suggests EPA may be more important for stabilizing existing plaque that we have in our arteries. Shout out to previous guest and friend, Dr. Alan Flanagan, for bringing that to my attention. Please note, I said the target range for most people should be 1 to 1.5 grams of active DHA and EPA per day. When you read omega-3 supplement labels, be careful not to look at the total oil per serve, but rather the total amount of DHA and EPA. It's the latter that should add to 1 to 1.5 grams per day. There can be other oils in the capsule, hence it's important to only pay attention to the DHA and EPA content. Based on all of this criteria, the brands that I recommend to help you optimize your omega-3 index are as follows. Starting with algae oil, because it's more sustainable than fish oil, and quite frankly, I'd love it if everyone adopted an algae oil where possible mindset here. 3 capsules per day of either the Omega-3 algae oil or Emil's Optimal Omega Plus. At the time of this video, Costco has a very good deal on the Omega-3 algae oil for those based in America. $29.99 for a 2-month supply. I'm actually shocked by how cheap this is. It's cheaper than almost all high quality fish oils that I've been able to find. Algae is the original source of DHA and EPA, the omega-3s that eventually make their way up the food chain and are found in fish. By going straight to the source, we can obtain these vital nutrients without the concerns associated with overfishing or contaminants found in some fish. It really is a win-win, effective for our health and friendly to our environment. And contrary to views that you may encounter on social media, algae oil has indeed been shown in clinical studies to reliably raise someone's omega-3 index to an optimal level. I asked Dr. Harris if there was any difference between the effectiveness of algae oil and fish oil, and here's what he had to say.
In terms of being absorbed and getting into tissues, yeah, it's absolutely as well absorbed and as well distributed in the body.
If you cannot get omega-3 in your location or aren't a member of Costco and price is an issue, or for whatever reason you would prefer fish oil, I personally haven't come across any other reasons than price, my recommendation would be Carlson's Maximum Omega 2000. 2 capsules per day will give you a little under 2 grams of combined DHA and EPA, so you'll likely only need to take this 4 times per week. An alternative to this is Garden of Life's doctor-formulated Advanced Omega. 1 serving per day provides 1.3 grams of combined DHA and EPA. Dr. Bill Harris recommends a re-esterified triglyceride form of fish oil. He has his own brand, Parasol Nutrition, which provides 1,400 milligrams of DHA and EPA in a 2-capsule dose. This is what Bill personally takes each day. At $69.95 for a 3-month supply, it's more cost-effective than Carlson's Maximum Omega, but surprisingly more expensive than the Omega-3 algae oil at Costco. I say surprisingly because usually algae oil is more expensive than fish oil, but that is not the case here. Foreseeing there will be comments, if Dr. Harris sells omega-3 supplements, he must be biased. Could be. Or it could be that he's so convinced by the evidence for supplementing omega-3s that he wanted to produce a high-quality supplement. His positions seem logically consistent, at least to me anyway, so I'm of the belief it's the latter. If someone's wondering, why measure LDL cholesterol and not LDL particle or ApoB, that some folks might say they're even more predictive of cardiovascular disease?
That's a good question. Yeah, if I could go back, I would do that. If I had more money, I could go back and I have stored blood. I could look at the ApoB. You can also look at the triglycerides as a hint. And here's an interesting critique of this study also is the people that, if you look at the main results, the triglycerides were up a little in the vegans and didn't change so much in the omnivores, which a lot of people that favor that small, dense LDL particle size hypothesis say, oh my God, they totally blew it. They didn't look. The triglycerides were way higher in the vegans. Not true. If you look at the p-value,
they weren't significantly
p-value
higher.
Wasn't even close to significant. And really what happens in triglycerides is you have these massively wide confidence intervals because human triglyceride levels are much more variable than LDL or HDL. Sorry to geek out there.
Yeah, you mentioned HDL before, and the difference in HDL was non-significant.
Right, but went down a little more in vegans.
Went down a little more in vegans, and that was another criticism that Mark Hyman had. He wondered why in the abstract you only spoke about LDL cholesterol and not HDL. My take on that, or I'm presuming that's because the LDL cholesterol finding was significant and the HDL was not.
It was primary and it was significant. And usually in the abstract, you can't go through all the secondary outcomes that you did. There isn't enough room in the abstract. I feel like these days HDL isn't as exciting as it used to be. A lot of people have considered it less of a causal factor. And we've actually had RCTs where they raised HDL and it was not protective. It's been more along the lines of observational that, wow, it sure looks like people with high HDL have better health outcomes. That doesn't necessarily mean raising it will help. Does that mean lowering it hurts? So I don't think anybody's ever tried to lower HDL to see if it would decrease your lifespan. But I've seen much less enthusiasm for HDL these days. But when you do this type of study, if you didn't list LDL, HDL, and triglyceride, a reviewer would critique right away and say, where's the full lipid profile?
Yeah, I know someone like Thomas Dayspring, who's been on the show, would say he doesn't trust any ratio with HDL in it anymore as a predictor of risk of cardiovascular disease. I just thought then, though, you don't have ApoB data, but I think non-HDL very closely approximates ApoB, which could be analyzed without having to run more tests.
I could definitely go back and look at that. We could pay more money and thaw some blood and look at ApoB. I'd be happy to do that in the future.
How were the results analyzed? Because I know this was an open label study in that you can't blind the subject to what diet they're eating. You kind of know if you're in the omnivorous or the vegan group. But the researchers in your team, they were blinded.
Absolutely. So not the dietitians who are asking what they're eating, not the health educators who are telling them how to eat the most healthful diet. They all knew. But anyone analyzing results was blinded. We said orange and purple.
Mm-hmm.
And so nobody knows till the end, till we unblind. That's why the folks doing the biological clock said, God, can you please tell us which one this is? Multiple times, Louis, the producer, came to us and said, when can we unblind? Because something's different, and I can't wait to see what it is, and I'm praying and hoping for the sake of my film that this works, but nobody's telling me which direction they're going in. We keep it blinded till the end.
And what were the main takeaways or main results for these cardiometabolic markers?
LDL was lower, insulin was
significantly lower.
And body weight was lower, which I hadn't expected in that short amount of time. LDL, one thing that not many people have picked up on, which I think is interesting, just because you randomize doesn't mean people will be exactly the same, and it's impossible that they're exactly the same on everything. Given that LDL is the primary outcome, the vegans had a lower LDL at baseline than the ones assigned to omnivore. They had less room for improvement. They were, you might have the numbers in front of you, and I'm not sure I remember, but it's something like the vegans were about 100, and the omnivores were about 110, or 114 maybe.
At baseline?
At baseline.
Vegans were 110, and the omnivores were 118.
Okay, so that means there's less room for improvement, right? And so the vegans, so the outcome of interest is the change. So one of the worst things in science is if you have two groups like this, and at the end of the day, this group lowers it to here. I don't know who's watching and who's listening right now, so I can't see what I just did with my hands, right? So I'll just say, if you were, let's say you were 118, and sorry, what were the vegans again? 110?
110.
Yeah. So what if one group lowered from 118 to 110 and 110 stayed the same? And you could just say, fabulous. This group lowered their outcome and this group remained the same. They win. And somebody else looks at it and says, they both ended up at 110. Well, how does that mean somebody won? Maybe 110 is the basement and you can't go any lower than 110.
Right, it might be easier to fall the higher you are.
Yeah. So that, and I've seen a couple studies like that, and then you have to trip all over yourself trying to come up with the words to explain why. I know they ended up in the same place, but I still think it's important. In this case, the vegans who were already lower lowered their LDL cholesterol by another 14 points or something like that. And the omnivores barely moved. So not only did they have more than a 10% drop in LDL cholesterol, they did it in the face of having an unwanted lower LDL than the omnivores at baseline. Maybe too geeky, but I actually think that strengthens the point that they did better.
Yeah, I was trying to interpret what that means for risk of cardiovascular disease.
Oh.
And I'll share with you where, how I kind of tried to calculate that, and you can tell me what you think. So looking at the paper, I think the difference was about 14 milligrams per deciliter in terms of the lowering of LDL cholesterol between the two groups. So the vegans had a 14 milligrams per deciliter greater reduction in LDL cholesterol over 8 weeks. And do you know Kevin Mackey? Have you come across his work?
Sure.
Oh, you know him?
Yeah.
So he wrote this paper, I'll put this into the show notes, that was trying to determine the reduction in cardiovascular disease risk that you get when adopting a plant-based dietary pattern.
Uh-huh.
And one of the kind of neat things that he did was he went and looked at genetic Mendelian randomization studies and looked at, okay, we know we have these populations of people that have genetically low LDL cholesterol. We can now work out for every 1 millimoles per liter lowering, which is 18 milligrams per deciliter. I'm going off my head here.
Yeah.
We know that if exposed to that over a lifetime, because that matters, right? Cholesterol years, then these people have about a 50 to 55% reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease. So 18 milligrams per deciliter for every 18 milligrams per deciliter lower LDL cholesterol. If maintained over the lifetime, you get this 50 to 55% reduction. Okay, so then I was looking at your results. It's a 14 milligram per deciliter difference, so not all the way to this 18, but it's about 40% of it. Sorry, it's about 80% of it.
Yeah.
Which we could kind of extrapolate and say that if the subjects in this study were able to maintain that diet over decades of their life, it could be around a 40% reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, it's not true. It's clinically significant, that drop. In my day, back 30 years ago, we used cut points of 130, 160, and 190. And so if you had people, I would often recruit people with elevated LDL, which was between 130 and 160, and try to get it below 130. Today, that would be a joke. The drugs are there to put the LDL at 50 or 70. So the goal now is under 100 or to 70 or under 70 or to 50. So diet's not going to do that. But that drop you just mentioned is clinically significant. Could be not being on a drug, or it could be on a lower dose of drug if you add a diet to it. Clinically relevant, absolutely.
How much of that reduction is due to the difference in calorie intake and weight loss?
So you could tease that apart if you wanted. And you could tease apart the amount due to the fiber and the part due to the saturated fat, and you could tease it all apart, which is why there should be multiple studies, not just one. So we only have one. We didn't tease it apart.
But if you were to guess or hypothesize?
No, you could make, so one of my studies years ago, one of my first big published studies was in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and we made 2 low-fat diets, and one was very convenience food-based, and one was very plant food-based. And so convenience food had chicken without the skin and mashed potatoes with light margarine and sugar-free cookies. And the other one had lentil soup with cheese on it, whole grain bread with butter on it, and a salad with egg in it. And the reason I said lentil with cheese and bread with butter and salad with egg is we matched the saturated fat and total fat and cholesterol in the 2 diets in a feeding study, and we forced them to keep the same calories. So actually, we fed them for a month.
So you've done what Peter Attia wanted you to do.
So every 3 days, if their weight was up or down in one direction, they got more calories added or calories taken away. So this is a 2005 publication. And I never said it out loud, but it was a vegetarian versus an omnivore diet. So just because those words can be polarizing, I just said this is a plant-based diet and this is a more typical diet. And when we did that, we doubled the LDL cholesterol lowering in the group that did plant-based at the same level of total fat and the same level of saturated fat. Very different fiber, very different antioxidants, but weight was maintained. So the convenience food group lowered their LDL by 7 milligrams per deciliter because it was a lower saturated fat diet than their usual. And the plant-based folks lowered it by 14 milligrams per deciliter. Same number.
So essentially what that tells us is that independent of any weight loss or difference in saturated fat, there are other properties of a plant-based diet that can lead to cholesterol lowering.
Yes.
And that could be it could be fiber. It could be less dietary cholesterol as well, which might have a little bit of an impact.
Yeah.
Tiny,
I think.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.